She wasn't a famous queen. She didn't make speeches, led armies, or build grandiose palaces, but she was there. In the midst of the comings and goings of Judah's court, among the advisors, soldiers, and servants, there was a woman called AZUBA. Her name is not remembered like David's or Solomon's, but it was within her that the one who would continue the royal lineage was born. The daughter of Siloam, AZUBA grew up in a time of tension and new beginnings. The people of Judah had faced divisions, internal wars, and unstable leaders. Faith oscillated between fidelity to God and the temptation of foreign idols. AZUBA was brought up in this scenario, where every decision could mean life or death, blessing or judgment. She didn't come from an ordinary family. Siloam, her father, although hardly mentioned, belonged to a lineage that had access to the elite. Perhaps that's why AZUBA became close to Asa, a young prince with a heart for the Lord, unlike many who came before him. When Asa took over the throne of Judah, he stood out from the start for doing what was right, and it was at his side that AZUBA became queen. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting Bible stories and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. If you like the content, feel free to support our work with a financial aid by clicking on the Thanks a Lot button. You can also become a member of the channel and enjoy exclusive benefits. But being queen in Israel wasn't like in fairy tales. There was no luxury all the time, no endless parties. There was pressure, there was expectation, and there was silence. A strange silence, which envelops AZUBA's name like a veil. She doesn't appear in the accounts of political decisions or her husband's battles, but she was there, witnessing everything. Time passed, and Asa's reign took shape. He tore down pagan altars, smashed sacred poles, cleansed the country of idolatrous practices like someone who sweeps a house before receiving a visitor. Meanwhile, AZUBA remained silent. Not a silence of omission, but the kind of silence that observes everything, that understands more than it speaks, that participates without imposing itself. She was the kind of woman that many didn't see, but everyone felt. When she walked past, people looked at her, not out of vanity, but because her presence was firm, almost invisibly strong. There was a balance in her between gentleness and resistance, like the water that skirts the stone, but never loses its way. AZUBA saw the tensions of the throne up close, external enemies trying to invade, internal threats trying to corrupt, false prophets disguised as allies, the people always impatient, always oscillating between faith and fear, and Asa, her husband, trying to be king and servant of God at the same time, trying to keep his nerve without losing his direction. How many times must she have whispered advice between the palace walls? How many silent prayers did she say while the people slept? How many nights awake, feeling the weight of being married to a man called to lead an entire nation? But her name hardly appears. It is only mentioned as someone who is present, like a signature at the bottom of an important document, but which no one reads carefully. That says a lot. Sometimes the most essential are the least remembered. There's an irony there, one of those ironies that only God fully understands. And it was precisely during this time of shadow and responsibility that AZUBA discovered what it meant to be a mother. Because before the people of Judah knew it, she already felt growing inside her the one who would be the next to carry the weight of the crown. The palace walked in a different kind of silence that season. It wasn't the silence of war or intrigue. It was a different kind, the silence of waiting. AZUBA was carrying a son in her womb, King Asa's firstborn, the heir to the promise. And even without trumpets or official announcements, everyone knew something big was about to be born. She felt his every move as if his body was talking to his soul. It wasn't just the weight of the pregnancy, it was the weight of knowing that this boy wouldn't just be hers. He would belong to the people. It would be the throne's. It would be, above all, God's. AZUBA didn't just give birth to a child, she gave birth to continuity. She created a future, His name had already been whispered in prayer. Josaphat, a strong name with the sound of leadership, the smell of purpose. She imagined him running through the halls of the palace, then sitting next to his father, paying attention to the affairs of the kingdom, copying the gestures, listening too much for his young age. Children like that always listen more than they speak. But before all that, he would have been hers alone. The first voice that Josaphat would hear would be AZUBA's. The first touch, the first comfort, the first care. A mother's lap isn't just shelter, it's school. And AZUBA understood that the way she raised him would shape not only her son's heart, but the destiny of a nation. While Asa dealt with the demands of the throne, AZUBA molded the future king with hands of love and discipline. She knew that faith is learned at home, long before it is preached in the temple. That's why, even in the midst of the royal life of a palace, where food is plentiful but peace is scarce, she made a point of teaching about the God of Israel. But time never stops, and the boy who was growing in wisdom would soon see for himself that not every reign ends as it began. Jehoshaphat was already walking with firm steps through the palace when Asa's reign began to show signs of wear and tear. The once zealous king was now showing signs of weariness. Decisions no longer came so clearly. The man who had once trusted fully in God began to make human alliances, relying more on political strategies than divine direction. AZUBA watched everything closely. Her eyes no longer shone with the same charm as when she first met Asa. Now there was a certain heaviness in her gaze, like someone who senses the change in the wind before a storm. She didn't complain, but she felt it. With every new dubious decision the king made, she felt a tightness in her chest, not out of pride, but out of fear. The meetings in the palace became tense. Advisors trying to please, others with ulterior motives, and Asa no longer listened as he used to. When the prophet Hanani confronted him, instead of repenting, Asa had him arrested. AZUBA was there. She didn't say anything, but her silence spoke loudly. She knew that the throne could sway, and when a throne sways, it is those behind it who support it, in the room, in prayer, in resistance. It was during this time that AZUBA's faith was refined, not a noisy faith full of promises and declarations, but a firm faith of someone who knows God well enough not to doubt, even when everything seems to be going wrong. Jehoshaphat saw everything, and like any attentive son, he noticed his mother's posture more than his father's words. She was the one who kept the peace in the house, even when the kingdom was in conflict. She was the one who remembered the covenant with God, even when the king himself seemed to have forgotten. Not everyone knew it, but that boy who ran between the stone pillars of the palace carried much more than royal blood in his veins. Jehoshaphat was the link between a past of promise and a future of hope. When AZUBA held him as a baby, there was something different in her eyes. Like someone who knows she's carrying more than a child, she's carrying a destiny. She didn't need anyone to tell her. She felt it. A mother feels. There was something in Josaphat that shone from within, a mature calm, a kind of sensitivity that didn't match his age. While other boys lost themselves in noisy games, Josaphat was the type to observe. He remained silent, but his eyes were attentive. AZUBA, with his discreet wisdom, taught him the old ways. She told stories of kings who obeyed and prospered, and of others who turned their backs on God and paid dearly for it. She didn't preach, she lived, and that taught more than any speech. Behind the scenes of the palace, where the corridors echoed with intrigue and eyes were always too attentive, she created a real space. A home, even if it was surrounded by stone walls. The kind of place where Jehoshaphat could hear God's voice whispering in the midst of chaos. While Asa hardened his heart and turned away from the Lord, AZUBA did the opposite. He plunged even deeper into faith, like someone who anchors himself before the storm. And there, in the silence of the nights, and in small conversations with her son, she was watering something invisible, something that one day the whole people would see flourish. But the rain didn't wait. Asa fell ill. The throne began to slip out of the king's hands. And in the midst of all this, AZUBA's name gradually began to disappear from the records. Suddenly, she began to disappear, not physically, but from words. The records, which had previously cited AZUBA as King Asa's wife and the mother of his heir, now barely mentioned her name. It was as if she had been erased little by little, like ink fading over time. But those who know behind the scenes of history know, absence in the lines is not absence in life. AZUBA was there. When the king fell seriously ill in his feet and refused to seek God, she was still there. When Jehoshaphat began to prepare to take the throne, she was there. Perhaps not in the meetings of the elders, perhaps not among the scribes or in the public ceremonies, but in the places that really make a king, inside the house, in the advice given in a low voice, in the eyes that say more than words. Her disappearance from the accounts may have been strategic. Forgetfulness? Perhaps. Or maybe it was the way the chroniclers of the time dealt with women, putting them in the background even when they held the whole scene. AZUBA didn't need a title to be essential. Her influence wasn't a scepter, it was a root. The curious thing is that the less we talk about her, the more we notice her presence, because when Jehoshaphat ascended the throne, he wasn't just another king. He showed a fear of God that seemed to come from the cradle. He ruled justly, sought divine guidance, strengthened the people in their faith, and there in his actions, AZUBA's voice echoed, even if her name was no longer there. The irony of it all is almost poetic. The world forgets, but the legacy remains. She was like those trees planted out of sight, but which support the earth beneath the feet of the great. And while Jehoshaphat took his first steps as king, AZUBA followed, not in front, not behind, but in a place where few could see. The throne now had a new owner. Jehoshaphat, AZUBA's son, wore the royal mantle, but he didn't just inherit the weight of the crown. He carried what he had learned in silence. The palace was different. The air seemed lighter. The people who had been torn between fear and weariness began to feel hope again, but no one knew how much it had taken to get there. Asa's reign had left its mark. Unresolved wars, wrong alliances, open wounds. Jehoshaphat didn't take over a kingdom in peace. He took over a battlefield disguised as a palace, and there, between papers, broken promises, and urgent decisions, he began to act. But he wasn't alone. There was something guiding him, something that came from within, from deeper than the eye could see. It was AZUBA, not in the council halls, not in the official ceremonies, but in the principles that Jehoshaphat carried. The way he treated the Levites, his respect for the scriptures, his care for the people, all this had her touch. Because while Asa struggled with pride and illness, AZUBA worked on her son's soul. She knew chaos. She knew what it was like to see the throne wobble. That's why she made Jehoshaphat a steadfast man, even when everything around him was unstable. Her faith molded him like clay molds a vessel, with time, with skill, with pain. And now, the boy who had once watched everything in silence was beginning to show what he had learned. People looked at him and saw something new. But AZUBA knew. It wasn't new, it was continuity. It was the result of sleepless nights, advice in the hallway, prayers said with his face hidden between his hands. But the throne is not enough. Governing is easy on good days. The hard part is keeping your heart in the right place when everything seems to be working. And it was there, in the time of stability, that another of her legacies began to appear. Day after day, Jehoshaphat became a different king from the others. He didn't just seek victories on the battlefield, but also within the walls of the people's souls. While many worried about the gold in their coffers or the borders of their territory, he worried about something else, the heart of Judah. And this concern didn't come out of nowhere. It came from home, it came from AZUBA. She left no inheritance of stones or hidden treasures. What she passed on could not be seen, but it could be felt. Jehoshaphat sent the Levites to travel through the cities, teaching the people the law of the Lord. Those who do this understand that real power isn't about commanding, it's about teaching. That authority isn't a shout, it's an example. And he saw this from a young age, in his mother. While many kings relied on armies, Jehoshaphat relied on the word. While others sought alliances in exchange for favors, he sought God before any step. He was different. And that difference, which left his enemies confused and the people at peace, had a name, even if it wasn't spoken: AZUBA. The advisors saw a king who was a strategist. The soldiers saw a firm leader. But only those who really knew him knew. He was a reflection of something greater. He was the fruit of someone who lived faith without having to announce it. AZUBA didn't ask for recognition. She knew that what you plant in silence blossoms at the right time. And now, every town that heard the voice of the Levites, every man who returned home with a greater fear of God, carried a little piece of what she had started back there, without applause, without a crown. But time went on, and history didn't wait. AZUBA, who had always been among the shadows, gradually receded from the scene. No one knows for sure when AZUBA left. No parchment recorded the day, no ceremony was described. The silence that had always accompanied her also surrounded her end. She disappeared like someone who knew she didn't need to stay. But even though she was gone, she was still there. In every gesture made by Jehoshaphat, in every decision made wisely, in every prayer said before a battle. She didn't leave memories that were told out loud, but she left a mark on the kind of memory that you feel in your chest, the kind that appears in difficult moments, like advice that comes back out of nowhere, like an invisible presence that embraces you in the midst of doubt. Jehoshaphat moved on, but it was as if he was carrying his mother inside. And the curious thing is that, even without her around, his reign seemed to be guided by hands that had been there before. He chose to teach the people, not impose. He chose to look to God for direction, not to men. He chose to listen before he acted, and he certainly didn't learn that in the corridors of politics. With every step of justice, with every attitude of humility, AZUBA appeared, even without appearing. Because a legacy doesn't die, it changes shape, it hides itself in attitudes, it breathes through choices. The people saw Jehoshaphat as a good king, perhaps the best since David. But few knew how many roots there were under that leafy tree. Roots planted in prayer, teaching, and faith, all planted by a woman who, although forgotten in the pages, was remembered by heaven. And while the throne held firm, while peace reigned in Judah, while enemies looked on from afar without the courage to attack, the story continued. Because the cycle didn't stop with Jehoshaphat. The blood of promise continued to flow, and once again, God began to prepare the next chapter. AZUBA, a name that many might overlook, like someone who reads a quick line and then turns the page. But what seemed small hid a silent greatness. She didn't take the pulpit, she wasn't part of the wars, she didn't write psalms or prophecies, but it was in her womb that a king was born. And not just any king, one who walked in the ways of the Lord, even when everything around him was going the other way. It's strange to think that so much came from someone who hardly had a voice in the records. But that's where the secret lies. AZUBA didn't need to appear to make history. She was a seed. And seeds work in silence, underground, where no one can see. While the court was in turmoil, while the men were discussing strategies and alliances, she was teaching, shaping, praying, and waiting. Jehoshaphat bore this name, but he also carried his mother's invisible inheritance. Every just decree, every gesture of humility, every search for God in the midst of chaos, all had her touch. AZUBA was like a root. She doesn't appear, but without her, the tree won't stand. And even after she left, what she planted continued to grow. Because that's the power of a life well lived. It continues, even after the end. The people of Judah were growing stronger, the cities were coming into line, faith was gaining ground again. It all seemed like the work of a good king. It was, but it was also the work of a good mother. And as the days went by, time showed that in every generation, God chooses ordinary people to do eternal things. People that no one expects, that no one highlights, but that he himself raises up at the right time. And that's where AZUBA's story hasn't ended yet, because what she represents lives on to this day. AZUBA's story ends as it began, quietly. No big signs, no statues, no celebrations, but that doesn't mean it was small. On the contrary, it is in her simplicity that the force that drives everything lives. The truth is that some people don't need to be at the center of the scene to make a difference. AZUBA taught us this with every step she took away from the spotlight. She wasn't looking for recognition. She knew who she was, and she knew the God she served. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Her life shows that not every call comes with a trumpet. Sometimes it comes with a child on your lap. It comes with a firm gesture in a moment of crisis. It comes with silence while everyone is talking too much. She teaches that legacy is not about fame, it's about truth, with faith, with constancy. She didn't live for herself. She lived to fulfill a role, one that only makes sense once history has moved on. And even when she was forgotten by men, heaven remembered every prayer, every teaching, every choice made with her heart set on God. We learned from AZUBA that it doesn't matter how big our appearance is. What matters is the size of our surrender, and that sometimes the greatest mission of our life can be in a small gesture, in a daily care, in a child who goes beyond. Because while the world seeks prominence, God seeks roots. And AZUBA was a firm root, one that no one can see, but which sustains everything that follows. That's why, even in silence, even almost erased from history, she continues to speak. She continues to teach. And maybe, just maybe, God is still raising up many other AZUBA out there. If you liked AZUBA's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.